Quan was tired. It was late afternoon, and he had been performing healing ceremonies all day. On little sleep, cures for headaches, for cuts and grazes, for insomnia. He had even been asked to help a young man who feared he had been cursed by the mountain witch, since he could no longer shoot an arrow straight and true. There had been 3 births during the night, and he had been needed there too. Not in the tipi. No men were allowed in there during a birth, not even the medicine man. But outside, giving advice through the tent flaps, helping the mothers to breathe, to focus, and having the honor of naming each child as it came into the world. He named all the children. And now, his healing done for the day, he had found the time to heal himself in the noisy peace of the town saloon. He sipped his 4th whiskey and licked his lips and watched the locals fighting over cards. It was always the same in this place, and that is why he liked it. One of the reasons he liked it. Another reason was Miss Pearl, who owned the bar and who worked there most nights when she wasn't working upstairs as a madam. She was there now, dealing with a cowboy who thought himself better than he was and who couldn't hold his drink. "Well, now, it's you again." Miss Pearl didn't smile. She didn't frown. She just stood with her hands on her hips and her ringlets bouncing on her shoulders. "Didn't I tell you last time you weren't welcome here no more?" The cowboy slumped onto a bar stool and grinned drunkenly. He slipped, catching his chin on the thick, beer-soaked mahogany bar, cutting his lip on his own tooth. He didn't seem to notice and hauled himself up again, never taking his eyes from Miss Pearl's chest. Come on now, darlin'. Just one little drink, that's all I'm asking." The drunk jabbed a calloused finger toward Quan and sneered. "And you're serving this here in Jun, so you've got to serve a white boy like me." Then he laughed, snorted, gave Quan the slightest of scowls. Quan ran his hand over his long, gray hair, tugging at the braids. He rubbed at his scalp where it parted perfectly in the middle, the red clay he used to decorate the skin coming off on his hands. He was suddenly self-conscious, the only Native American in the saloon. It wasn't normally a problem. His tribe was good for trade, good for money, so he was generally left alone. But every now and then, Quan turned to the man. "Now, Quitap, I may be an Injun, but I am not deaf." He smiled sweetly. "And I am a medicine man, so unless you are looking to be cursed, I would do what the good lady says and get out of here. Now, what did you call me, Comanche?" The cowboy slid from his stool and took 6 paces, unsteady, intoxicated paces, so that he was standing face to face with Quan. "'Cause you know I don't speak no voodoo." Quan smiled, feeling a little lightheaded himself, feeling brave with it, feeling powerful. "There's no need for you to worry, Gunsel. It's just a word. Just a word, like rustler is just a word." The cowboy's face turned puce. His fingers clicked across the gun that sat hitched in a holster on his scarred old belt. The saloon was silent now. Quan had taken one step over the line that shouldn't be crossed, but it was too late to backtrack now. He had to just keep going, and damn the consequences. "What the hell did you say?" The words came out straight and sharp, with no hint of liquor behind them now. Quan knocked back his whiskey, glanced at the gun, and winked. "Why? You're not afraid of a few little words, are you?" Under his breath, Quan began to mutter strange incantations. He was panicking just slightly, tipping back and forth between thinking he was about to die and thinking he might just get out of the saloon without starting a brawl, and him shot to hell in the middle of it. The words were ailments, some Comanche, some Dutch, some completely made up on the spot. It didn't matter. What mattered was making the cowboy piss his pants. "Are you cursing me? Are you cursing me, Redskin? Is that what you're doing?" The cowboy's voice had risen an octave or so, and he peered around the room, wide-eyed, to make sure everyone knew what was happening. "Because if you are..." The drunk reached for his gun, drew it, and never finished his sentence. The swing door of the saloon burst open and 6 Comanche entered. They were sweating, the day's late sun still hot on their backs, and the cowboy shrieked and fell to the floor, his hands on his head. "Don't hurt me. I'm sorry. Just don't hurt me." The Comanche ignored him. It was Quan they were looking for. The rest of the saloon went back to their drinking and their card games, and the sobbing cowboy stayed where he was, too afraid to move. Quan, you must come back to the reservation. We need a healer." Quan recognized grief and shock in that voice, but he was so tired, and he was a little drunk. He couldn't heal anyone like this. He tried to calm the man who had spoken. "Come now, Ahdoche. What can be the matter?" There were tears on the other man's face, and tears on this man's face meant trouble. He was the war chief, and as such was a revered and important member of the tribe. And he never, ever cried. "It's Nocona, my Nocona. He is hurt." He fell from his horse and was crushed by the hooves. "Please, Quan, he needs you. I need you. Please, a child then. That made a difference. That made all the difference. A child was a gift to the Comanche, precious, perfect, poised to become the elders, to take the tribe onwards towards paradise. And this one, Nocona, the war chief's youngest son, was particularly special. Everyone knew it. Everyone loved him. He would be something, or he would be if he survived. So he had to survive. Please, Quan, hurry. He is dying." The heavy-lidded brown eyes that pleaded with the medicine man were full, and the tears were ready to come again, no matter who saw it or what they thought. With a final guilty look back at the bar, at the empty shot glass, at Miss Pearl who knew everything but said nothing, Quan nodded quickly and ushered the group of Comanche out of the door. He put a comforting, he hoped, arm around Ahdoche's broad shoulders, and felt the fear and the grief that were fighting within the man's body and mind. In his soul, Quan mounted his horse feeling queasy. He hadn't expected to ride, and had planned a leisurely walk back to the reservation, his horse following behind, if he even remembered he had one. But now that time was of the utmost importance, he had to move quickly. The dusty scenery passed by with a dizzying, nauseating speed, and Quan was grateful when he could finally leap from the animal. He stumbled as he landed in the sand, but the rest of the group had already run onwards, and they did not notice. "Over here, hurry!" Ahdoche yelled out to the medicine man, and then knelt on the ground by a little bundle, something wrapped in blankets that had been placed by a small fire. The flames were crackling and smoking, and the bundle was completely still. Quan jogged, his head already full of an ache that he would have to wait to soothe. He knelt next to Ahdoche and pulled back the blanket. Nocona. A tiny boy, the runt of a large litter. Quan remembered his birth, his naming ceremony. He remembered last week when the child had come running to him, scared after his elder sister had told him the story of the Pia Mupitsi, the big cannibal owl, and how it was, on its way to eat him, Nocona had come to him, to Quan, and not his father. The war chief would have laughed and told the boy not to be silly, not to believe his sister's scary stories, and that was fine, only, as Nocona knew, they weren't just silly, scary stories at all, they were true. So he had come to Quan, because the medicine man never laughed at him, never told him that the legends were made up simply to terrify naughty children. Quan told him the truth. Quan told him the real stories behind the myths. Now Quan looked down at the broken body of the boy, bruised, bloody, trampled by a heavy horse and yet still trying to live. He took a deep breath and looked away as he exhaled so that no one smelled the liquor. He needs to be inside, in the healing tipi. "Let me take him, and I will see what I can do." Ahdoche reached out and took Quan's hand, looked him directly in his eyes. "Oh, thank you, thank you." Quan took his hand back and put it against Nocona's chill forehead. "Don't thank me yet, Ahdoche. I cannot promise anything." But Ahdoche chose not to hear the warning. Instead, he smiled, an uneasy, unsure sort of smile, and nodded. "Thank you." Quan lifted the dying boy as carefully as he could, but despite his gentleness, he still heard bones snapping. Was that Nocona's back, his neck? He gritted his teeth against the sound and walked away from the growing crowd. He needed space. He needed a mug of coffee. He needed some air. Instead of getting anything that he needed, Quan entered the small, close-heeling tipi. It was dark inside, and once he had placed Nocona on the mat laid out on the sandy floor, there was only room enough for Quan to sit cross-legged next to him and whisper prayers and incantations, even though he knew, now, that it was no good. On the short journey from the fireside to the tipi, Nocona had died. Now Quan could only send up pleas to the gods to look after the little spirit, for his shadow soul to rest quietly with his body in eternal sleep, and for his free soul to wander happily in the afterlife. Quan waited for as long as he could, as long as seemed appropriate, so that it seemed that he had done something, that he had tried at least, and then he left the tipi alone to find Ahdoche. The man crumpled when Quan told him that his son had died. The big war chief sobbed and would not be comforted. "Did you do everything?" he asked, his voice hitching, disappearing, coming back weakly. "Did you?" "Of course I did. Of course. But poor little Nocona. His injuries were so great. He was so badly hurt. There was no saving him." Quan felt his palms spring with sweat. Had he done everything? Could he have been quicker? Or could he perhaps, had he not been drunk, have thought of something more, a different healing, an alternative prayer? "Of course I did. I don't know what to do now." Ahdoche was lost. He sat, the firelight flickering on his normally strong face, and looked around him. The tribe had formed a circle of grief, all of them already missing the little boy who had been such a life force once. "You should pray. Ask the spirits to help you now." "I will speak to the women," said Quan. "They will prepare the body, and then tomorrow a rider can take him into the mountains. I have already asked for safe and happy passage for his souls." "Thank you, Quan." This time the thanks was ragged and hopeless. Quan slept little that night. His remorse kept him awake, kept him thinking and thinking. In the morning, with the tiny body cleaned and wrapped in a newly weaved blanket, Ahdoche lifted it lovingly, kissed it, buried his face in the little patch of hair that was showing, and placed it on a horse behind a volunteer rider. The grieving father stepped back, running his hand along the body until he lost contact. "Take him safely," he instructed the rider. "Look after him." And then the body, the rider, and the horse were gone, kicking up dust in their wake. Up in the mountains, it was cold and bright. The rider dismounted when his horse began to have trouble climbing, and he led it onwards, clicking his tongue and easing the animal through cracks and crevices. He knew where he was heading. It was where he always took the bodies. It was cool and safe, unseen and unheard and unknown to all but him. He had been the death rider ever since he could carry a body, ever since he had lost his father in a hunt and had volunteered to take him up. Now he always did it. It wasn't that he enjoyed it exactly, but he did feel at peace with it. The dead held no fear for him. He just hoped that when it was his time there would be someone to take his body and shadow soul up to rest in peace. The cave had been created by two enormous rocks that had fallen against one another, leaving just a small opening and then darkness beyond it. The rider stepped inside, Nocona's body light in his arms. When the darkness had calmed and he could see, the man stepped forward and found a clear space amidst the bones on his tribe's people. And there he left Nocona to sleep forever. The tribe was ready for him when he returned. Ahdoche waited patiently as he drew closer, waited for confirmation that Nocona's remains were safe, and then he let out a mighty wail, signaling to the others that they could now perform the grieving ceremony. Everything that the little boy had owned, everything he had loved and cherished during his short life, was placed on a bonfire and burned to ashes. Ahdoche took a hunting knife and slashed at his arms, letting the blood drip onto the flames. And then he danced around the fire, singing, weeping openly. It was done, spent. The group drifted away to try and think of something else, to get on with things. Only Quan was left by the smoldering ruins. He had spoken little since the boy's body had been ridden away that morning. He hadn't eaten. He had barely had anything to drink. The guilt of what he had done and what he hadn't done was crushing him. He could feel it standing on his chest. He could feel his heart grow sharp, claws and try to slice its way out of him. And he had seen something. When the rider had returned, had rounded the corner and come back into the reservation, Quan had noticed something behind him. An owl, in daylight. A small owl, a small, dirty owl. It fluttered around the dusty trail that the horse left, swooping in and out of the sandy clouds. If it hadn't been for the memory of Nocona's fear of the big cannibal owl, Quan might not have thought too much of it. A strange anomaly, nothing more, just an owl out in the daylight. It happened. But he couldn't forget the look in the little boy's eyes when he talked about the Pia Mupitsi. Fear and awe, terror and fascination. So, he had said, the owl was a man whose free soul wouldn't rest. That's right. Quan had patted the boy on the head, glad he had assuaged some of the fear at least. So the free soul became a monster, and it vowed to avenge his death, which had happened too soon. It took the children of those who it thought had caused its body's demise. Nocona had seemed to understand, but as he stood to leave, he had asked one last question. But what if no one was really to blame? What then? And Quan had had no answer to that. But he had thought it best to answer, to say anything, I imagine. The medicine man had replied that the owl would have come for the tribe's medicine man because he had failed to save the man. Why had he said it? The boy had nodded sagely, happy to understand. But Quan felt nervous as soon as the words were out, and it had pulled and picked at his thoughts. The owl that had followed the rider down from the mountain alighted on Quan's tipi. It stared down at him. Quan chose to sleep under the stars that night, away from the camp, away from Ahdoche and the guilt, away from the owl. But sleep was a distant friend. Every time Quan closed his eyes, he felt something tickling his face, crawling over his eyelids, its spindly little legs caressing his parched lips. The medicine man sat up, scratching at his skin, wiping away something that wasn't there. The first time, he thought it was ants come to feast on him. The second time, he was convinced it was the owl hovering above him, waiting to pierce his eyes with its talons. The third time, he was sure it was Nocona, intent on revenge. The body back from the cave in the mountains, scraping its bony fingers over his face. When he awoke, he huddled against the rocks, his thin blanket wrapped around his shoulders. He could still feel the boy's fingertips on him, the owl's wings above him, the ants all over him. He sat and shivered and did not dare close his eyes again. In the morning, when the sun finally rose and granted the medicine man a little peace, Quan crawled back to the healing tipi and hid inside, whispering magic words to himself, protecting his body and his souls from the undead, from the monsters that waited for him outside. The tribe left him alone. He told them when they asked that he was preparing bombs and cures, that they had run low on everything, and that he could feel a battle coming. No one questioned him. He was the medicine man, after all. They let him get on with his work, and they whispered between themselves if they had concerns. The owl never left. It sat on the tipi and watched everything with interest. It never seemed to sleep. When he was sure there was no one around, Quan tried to speak to the bird. Nocona, Nocona, I know that it's you. Are you angry with me? Have you come for revenge, oh? Nocona, I'm so sorry. I truly am. Please forgive me. But the owl said nothing and continued to watch the world. The owl didn't sleep, and neither did Quan. He tried. He was so tired. But the fingers, definitely fingers, he knew that now, came for him, touched him, dug into his flesh, and made him bleed. When he dared to look, he saw thin trails of blood running down his stomach, along his cheeks, and the owl kept watching. But sleep is a powerful monster, and it has to come in the end. When it came for Quan, he could feel it seeping through his bones. His weary eyes were pulled closed, and although he fought it, he couldn't win. After 10 days, the tribe could no longer believe that all was right with Quan. Medicine did not take that long to make, and they told one another that they thought they had heard the man weeping in the night. They thought they had seen him talking to nothing and no one, although over the past week they had heard nothing and Quan had not been seen. Ahdoche eventually moved through the sea of people congregating outside of the hut. Let me through. Let me in. He pulled open the tipi flaps and recoiled at the stench inside. It was sweet and putrid. It was death and decay. In the corner of the tipi, surrounding by oils and herbs and plants, was a heap of clothes and rotting flesh that was crawling with hundreds of hungry black ants. And yet, the body that had been Quan was still living. It heaved in a breath through ragged, leaking lips, and with a skeletal hand it grasped Ahdoche's buckskin. Pia Mupitsi, even the war chief, a man who had seen so much death in his life, was disgusted. He stumbled back, kicking out at Quan's remains, trying to get away, succeeding only in detaching the medicine man's hand from his wrist. The decaying monster spoke again. Pia Mupitsi, the cannibal, all came for me, and it was Nocona. I had to sleep, Ahdoche. I had to, and when I did, it came for me. It ate me, devoured my souls, and now I cannot rest. I will never rest. Ahdoche couldn't understand. The words were jumbled, a mumbled mess, but he knelt and drew his hunting knife. Oh, Quan, when Nocona died and my heart was breaking, you told me to ask the spirits for help. So I did. I prayed for death to come to you, and I prayed for you to suffer because you failed my son. The war chief smiled as he slit the gnawed, moldering skin on Quan's throat. You give good advice, medicine man. I see my prayers were answered. As the blood drained from Quan's body, the owl, unseen and unheard and unknown, took flight back into the mountains. It was time to sleep.